On the 27th of June 2024, Nintendo conducted the annual general meeting of its shareholders, and a lot of the information has now surfaced. I feel like the documentation provided with the meeting is worth recapping, as although much of it is restating policies Nintendo has had for some time, it provides a strong explanation as to how the company manages, for example, currency risk, something this channel has explored before as a potential source of difficulty for Nintendo as they look to launch a new system, and it also includes the beginnings of a plan for how Nintendo might handle a hostile takeover. There's also some fun details in the Q&A, so we'll have a look at that as well. Now, to be clear, this meeting is not exactly intended to set anybody's pulses racing. There is, as you might expect, a good deal of dry financial information about the status of shares for stockholders, arrangements for retirement benefits for staff members, and how Nintendo's accounting practices deal with advanced sales on software. Nintendo also get a clean bill of health from independent auditors PricewaterhouseCoopers of Japan, which will no doubt make Shuntaro Furukawa's day, given his bean counting background. Still, let's look at one particular section provided by Nintendo, which refers to the current status of its financial instruments. I've looked in previous videos about the enormous amount of cash Nintendo has on hand and why this is beneficial for the company, and they confirm right at the start that the company invests in financial assets such as deposits that are highly secure. The note goes on to confirm that where it holds bonds, it does so in financial institutions with strong credit, but that these are, their words, subject to the risk of fluctuations in exchange rates and the risk of fluctuations in market price, and holdings are continually monitored through regular checks of currency market values and financial positions of the issuers. However, Nintendo clearly feels that these are better bets than stocks, and they confirm they only really hold stocks when, as they say, the company group has business relations. Again, I've looked at the companies Nintendo holds stocks in previously, so I will link that video in the notes and at the top. However, they also refer to derivative transactions, which they say mainly consist of forward exchange contracts, non-deliverable forward foreign exchange transactions, and currency option transactions that are mainly intended to reduce the risk of fluctuations in exchange rates associated with foreign currency deposits and trade receivables. It also notes, of course, that Nintendo does not conduct speculative transactions and emphasizes the close scrutiny of such transactions. So, to be clear, this language is not new. It's a standard part of Nintendo's financial reporting, and the wording has not significantly changed in over a decade, but I still think it's interesting because it confirms their intent, and of course we can also see the derivative transactions, at least in terms of the market value, on a balance sheet for every year going back and back. The data for the Switch era is shown on screen in millions of yen, and as once observed by one of the great educators of our age, one of these things is not like the others, one of these things doesn't belong. Clearly, 2018 is a massive disruption to their trend of having fairly stable income or fairly modest losses from derivatives. Derivatives they are using primarily, it seems, to deal with risks associated with foreign exchange rates. My hunch here is that the explanation probably links to the surprise success of the Nintendo Switch in 2017 and 2018, and the company's struggle to manufacture more in quick succession, which probably led them to make fast but less favourable deals than would have been possible if they could have anticipated the level of demand the Switch would incubate. Another reason why they might want to be exceptionally cautious about all aspects of their succession planning is that while anticipating demand for a console is notoriously difficult, after all, even in relatively benign international market conditions, let alone the ones we have at the moment, they have had this negative experience from 2018 where they called the potential success of the Switch wrong and paid at least some level of price, albeit that the huge success of the console would have more than outweighed any loss in their derivative transactions. Another interesting element, although again something that has been fairly standard wording in recent years, is Nintendo's statement regarding company control, i.e. how they would resist a hostile takeover. While it's no great revelation, I think this is pretty interesting, so I will read the relevant section below. Their basic policy regarding the company's control. The company's board of directors believes that the decision of whether to accept another party's tender or other acquisition offer for the purpose of making large purchases of the company's stock ultimately should be entrusted to its shareholders, given that the stock of the company, which is a public company, is freely traded. However, it is likely that certain tender or acquisition offers may harm the company's corporate value or the common interests of shareholders, depending on the intent of the offer, etc. The company's board of directors maintains that such tender or acquisition offers are inappropriate. As of now, any specific defensive measure in the event of a tender acquisition offer has not yet been officially introduced, but the company has already set up an internal system to deal with such an event. If a tender or acquisition offer is proposed, the company will carefully judge its potential impact on its corporate value and the common interests of shareholders and take appropriate measures with due care and prudent management. Specifically, in addition to evaluating the offer with outside experts and negotiating with the party making the offer, the company will establish a task force to decide on whether any specific defensive measures are necessary. If the offer is deemed inimical to the company's corporate value or to the common interest of its shareholders, the defensive measures will be determined and implemented in accordance with relevant laws and regulations. Of course, I seem to recall that when Microsoft looked to buy out Nintendo at one point, Nintendo literally laughed in their faces, which I'm sure is a defensive measure that is covered by Japanese laws and regulations. However, while most of this documentation is really fairly standard stuff, in the Q&A section there are also some fun questions. One detail not recorded in Nintendo's official version, but indicated on Twitter by Oatmeal Dome, who came up with the initial translations, was that reportedly Shinya Takahashi had a big smile on his face during the discussion of Metroid Prime 4. I don't quite know how true this is, as people have said he looked similarly jubilant during the direct reveal, and I'm not sure personally he seemed that much more elated than he normally is unveiling a new project, but nevertheless, it must be a weight of his mind to have the game finally out of the shadows. I have to say here the questions being asked were pretty varied. Furukawa-san gave a general non-committal answer about adaptation for gamers with visual impairments, talked about countermeasures against scalping, including his aim to produce enough consoles at launch. In fact, the less widely reported bit of his answer about scalping that really amuses me is that he says, "We are taking into account circumstances in each region and considering what measures can be taken within the limits of the law." The visual image of Shintaro Furukawa going full-on Batman on some scalpers does kind of tickle me, but of course he will stick within the law, which may come as a relief to the more super-villainous scalpers. He also talked briefly about Nintendo and generative artificial intelligence, and of course, if you want more on that, I have a video on Nintendo and AI, which goes into a bit more detail than the answer does here. There is another question on new IP, and I should highlight that Nintendo has already in their recent governance report confirmed that they are working on new intellectual property, something which Shinya Takahashi pretty much reiterates. One interesting bit of backroom 3D chess is that they no longer announce interim earnings forecasts, as these can be thrown by movements in the dates of their bigger titles. This does explain why there are often games released in the March window, not just because it's the end of the financial year, but also that it's the latest that they can reasonably push a game without potentially having a major negative effect on their financial forecasts if it's pushed any further. It's curious then that big titles like Animal Crossing and even Capcom's Monster Hunter Rise released in March, while Tears of the Kingdom, a game that they had already committed to taking as long as they needed on, was in the new financial year, perhaps owing to a recognition by Nintendo that they were never going to pressure the development team to stick within the strict limits of a March 2023 release schedule, even though it had previously been announced as a 2022 game, and March 2023 might have seemed the obvious fallback position. A major topic of interest of the channel is hedge risk, as I mentioned at the top of the video, and to this day the channel's most successful video dealt with essentially this topic, pointing out that there is a risk with a weak yen that Nintendo's production activities in foreign currencies could become more expensive. But if the yen then corrects itself in the months between the manufacture and production of their new system and the system launch, then Nintendo could face a second currency penalty because they'd now be selling those more expensive to produce systems in foreign territories but making less of them than they would have done a couple of months prior. Of course, Nintendo will have many financial instruments to deal with these kinds of risk, but the massive scope of the enterprise of launching a new console, coupled with the perilousness of the timing and the fact that they have historically always in financial documentation identified currency risk as one of, if not the, greatest areas of uncertainty they face in their business, makes me still convinced that this would have been at least some part of the discussion around the Switch successor launch schedule. Therefore, let's have a read of this in its entirety. The questioner asked, regarding your production system going forward, are you considering measures to deal with the weak yen and hedge risk, such as by strengthening manufacturing within Japan or increasing the numbers of countries with production bases? And bear in mind, of course, that Nintendo has already moved a lot of its production over to Vietnam. Shuntoru Furukawa replies, Nintendo's sales outside Japan account for nearly 80% of total sales, so generally speaking, a weaker yen has a positive impact in that it boosts sales. On the other hand, most of our material procurement is in US dollars, so if the yen weakens, the positive impact on sales is partially counteracted. Furthermore, our foreign subsidiaries in the US, Europe and elsewhere incur expenses denominated in foreign currencies such as advertising and labour, so a weaker yen has a negative impact on profits. Given this situation, the benefit of a weaker yen lessens at the operating profit level rather than at the sales level. So to unpick that a bit, essentially what he's saying is that because Nintendo has a variety of costs, including ones that they choose to buy in US dollars, they aren't as fully exposed to the fluctuations of the yen as they might otherwise be. And I think it's particularly interesting when he talks about material procurement, which of course will become very significant as they look to manufacture the next Nintendo console. He goes on, Nintendo owns deposits and other assets denominated in foreign currencies, so if the exchange rate for the yen at the end of the financial year weakens compared to the end of the previous fiscal year, the re-evaluation will result in foreign exchange gains. Now at this point, Hirokazu Shinji, the senior executive officer, chimes in. And this is a person who I will be mentioning in another video that I'm working on right now, but who I think is going to be extremely important for the next year or so at Nintendo, because he is in charge of Nintendo's manufacturing. He says, we have a fabless production system. Fabless, by the way, meaning that they have outsourced the fabrication or fab to a specialized company, here presumably Nvidia, although potentially including the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and other partners that Nintendo have done business with over the years. So he says we outsource the manufacture of our products to our production partners. Now here's the bit that I think is really interesting. He says, it is challenging to create a system of production for our products because production volumes change significantly depending on demand. We need production systems that can respond to changes, including local risks, so we follow the situation in every country and the situation with our business partners daily and consult with them while working daily to achieve the optimal production system. So without harping on about this, I do think this is an insight into the insane level of scrutiny Nintendo has and will be having over the minute detail of their production line. Daily check-ins with their production partners with a tight control over volume is just the beginning. And if you think that's a big deal now in the twilight days of a console that is well established and where they've had plenty of time to work on making production as seamless as possible and to get their manufacturing forecasts really sharpened so they're producing just enough games and systems to meet demand, you can bet they are micromanaging the living daylights out of the next system's production line. There is also a question on extended production delays, another topic I've covered recently. You see, you've just got to be subscribed and following Nintendo Forecast to be ahead of this stuff. Let's look at this one in depth as well, because there are several parts in this answer that amuse me. Super Mario Bros. Wonder, released last year, goes the question, and was the first new 2D Mario game in 11 years. It seems that the software development for Nintendo Switch is taking longer than in the past. In terms of the gaming experience, I think it's important for players to have a series of memorable experiences at a young age, so it would be nice to see shorter development cycles and games released regularly, even if they are not major game titles, so young people have more opportunities to play games. Which is kind of an odd question if you ask me, because it focuses on young people, and in a sense, young people have 40 years of Mario titles to catch up on, and the opportunity to do so through things like the Nintendo Switch Online service. But anyway, the answers that Nintendo provide are a little mixed. Firstly, Shuntaro Furukawa says, game development today is more prolonged, more complex, and more advanced. That is unavoidable. To deal with this, we are continually expanding our development resources and making the necessary investments. Fair enough, and we will cover this in a separate video in the future, but then Shinya Takahashi chips in and says, as hardware advances, it is inevitable that the software development takes longer, but I believe we are succeeding in our efforts to shorten development cycles, for example by steadily improving the development environment following the release of the hardware. And okay, I'm going to cut in here and open that up to the best and brightest of the Nintendo forecast community. The development environment following the release of hardware. I just wonder, what does that really mean in brass tack terms? Unified development engines, or is this a translation quirk and he just means that the next hardware will come alongside a better development environment for the people who follow? I'm kind of intrigued by this comment, but anyway, Shinya Takahashi continues. Whether titles take a long time or a short time to develop, we want to make games that are fun. It is not as if Super Mario Bros. Wonder was under continuous development for nearly a decade. There was a long gap between the release of the previous title, New Super Mario Bros. U, and the current title because various initiatives and studies were made in the meantime. Going forward, we aim to continue with a variety of new offerings, and we hope you look forward to them. Fair enough, and if you detect a note of mild indignation in that answer, Takashi Tezuka continues that thread by saying, after we finished the Super Mario Bros. Wonder, I was reminded 11 years had gone by since the previous game. However, that doesn't mean we did nothing during that time. We developed several new Mario games such as Super Mario Maker series and the 3D Mario series. To reiterate Nintendo's creative philosophy, first we think about creating entertainment that has never been done before, regardless of whether it is a Mario series game or not. Then we think about how we can make it fun for everyone so they fall in love with Nintendo. All of our games involving Mario, not just Super Mario Bros. Wonder, are created with the goal of encouraging as many people as possible to enjoy them. As for upcoming new titles, some will take time to develop and others will be made in a short period of time. I hope you look forward to our new offerings. And I have to say I find it curious that he hadn't been aware of the specific length of time since a new 2D Mario game, given how vastly successful the Super Mario Bros. Games had been for Nintendo, but of course with Super Mario Run and 2 Super Mario Maker games, plus the new Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe port, and even Super Mario Bros. 35 and various side-scrolling sections in Odyssey, it's not like there wasn't a lot of 2D Mario action over the intervening years. I can absolutely see how the Mario Maker titles could have been seen as filling that 2D Mario space, and that's interesting because if you factor those in, these 2D Mario titles are coming out at a fairly steady 3 to 4 year schedule, and it makes me wonder whether a 2D Mario before the end of 2027 isn't made much more likely. As it stands, I think an original 2D Mario by the end of 2027 has to be a 70% chance, raising to 90% by 2029, but falling to 50% by the end of 2026. Another interesting moment is that Miyamoto confirms that he wants to, in his words, be actively involved in fun ventures such as creating new IP that can gain interest worldwide. Obviously the man has championed Pikmin in a massive way, but that IP is quite old now. I do like the idea that he is getting into the weeds of truly original IP, and I wonder if we could see something like that on the new system. Of course, New IPs can be many things, and it's not necessarily the case that this would be a title with mascot-style characters and a world in the manner of ARMS and Splatoon. We could be looking for more experimental titles like Labo and Ring Fit Adventure. Still, it would be fun to see Miyamoto-san finding an all-new property to champion in the way that he's championed Pikmin and even Star Fox. There is also a reference to how they would like to utilise game music going forward, although no specific plans are laid out. Well, that's all I have to say about the annual general meeting in June, so if that is all you came for, thanks for watching and I hope to see you again soon. However, last month I was having some internet problems that stopped me from posting a fuller analysis of the year-end financial report the company issued, and while it's slightly old news, I still think there are interesting revelations in that document that are well worth reviewing. The report is of course public for you to see, and I'll link the one with the notes Nintendo has provided in the show notes below. And I'm not necessarily going to go through every section, but rather focus on a handful of key revelations that merit discussion for one reason or another. So the highlight is that the profits are up this year, and while the talk of the death of the Switch may have made people think that this wouldn't be the case, this financial year included the Super Mario Bros. Movie and all associated merchandise, Tears of the Kingdom, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Through the delineation of mobile and IP-related income, which includes income from visual content and royalties such as the films, we can see that income from this aspect of Nintendo's business has nearly doubled. If we take the difference, 41.7 million yen, and express it as a percentage of the net sales, then we can say that the Super Mario Bros. Movie was directly responsible for about 2.5% of the profits last year. Of course, this assumes that all that increase was attributable to the film and not to other mobile initiatives, but it's an interesting rule of thumb and will be useful for when we eventually cycle round to looking at Nintendo Pictures and Nintendo's film and television enterprises. One curious factor attributed to this was the increase in proportion of the hardware sales accounted for by the OLED model, which has a higher unit price. What's interesting to me about this is that previously Nintendo had suggested that despite the higher price point, the margin on the OLED was not as good as the prior systems. With manufacturing now long established on that model though, they should have managed to get those margins into a healthier position. I think this could signal that finally, after all this time, the OG Switch line could be discontinued if they decide that having 3 concurrent models is no longer financially viable, and if they feel that the OLED model can be produced with similar or better margins compared to the original Switch. The increase in the proportion of digital sales also accounted for some of this increase. I have a previous video I talked about the previous games slowly going out of stock, and I wonder if this helped any, or if it was simply a mix of consumer choices, and perhaps also the choice to buy specific large games like Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder online instead of physically. Check out also their R&D expenses, up 25.2% again. 2 explanations for this one. 1. Nintendo is continuing to grow its domestic R&D departments, but the second explanation is that their expenditure is related to foreign excursions and materials acquisition, which is driving up their additional costs due to currency issues. Now, we do know that they are buying these materials in dollars and not yen, so the currency issues are somewhat mitigated, but even so, if they are planning to manufacture very large quantities of a new system, they are going to want to make sure that they have the materials they need to hand, and some of these potentially are quite expensive. Again, I've talked about Nintendo's relationship with some of the rare earth metals they need to acquire in a separate video, and at some point I will try to deep dive what we know about Nintendo's R&D approach, as it's generally very secretive. What's interesting to me though is that their advertising spend is up as well. There was of course a big push for Zelda mid-year, and Pikmin 4 received a sizable boost in Japan, but my hunch is that much of this is associated with advertising accompany the release of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Okay, the forecast for sales going forward. It is of course down across the board, but ignore that for a second and check out the assumptions they're using. It says the assumed exchange rates are 140 yen per US dollar and 155 yen per euro. In the previous financial year, the rates were 151.34 yen per dollar and 163.31 yen per euro. Basically, their own forecast anticipates that the yen will strengthen somewhat against the exchange rate from the current fiscal year to where they are now, which is of course a perfectly reasonable assumption, but just one that I think is an interesting reflection of their expectations. The most eye-catching initiative perhaps is the proposal to sell 13.5 million units of the Nintendo Switch, and for that matter, 165 million units of hardware. If you deduct the outsized sales of Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, that pretty much gets you to the difference between the previous financial year's just shy of 200 million units and their 165 million forecast. So that makes sense as long as they can zhuzh up interest in their evergreens to stop sales of those declining. As they say, we will work to maintain high user engagement with the hardware and invigorate the platform so that more consumers continue to play Nintendo Switch for longer. Of the titles that they've currently announced, I can certainly see Super Mario Party Jamboree being particularly effective in that endeavour, given how highly previous Mario Party games have sold on this system. On the hardware front, there were also some moves they could make, but I'll cover those in another video perhaps. Looking at sales, the success of evergreens like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Nintendo Switch Sports continue unabated. Getting these two titles into the Switch 2 library very early on is surely going to be a top priority for them, and I would put it at 90% that there will be at least one of these within the first 6 months of the new console. Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Tears of the Kingdom both sold healthily, although it's interesting that Tears of the Kingdom seems to have reached a bit of a ceiling in terms of its purchases. It's a really high ceiling and puts it in the top 10 of all Switch games sold, but I wonder whether they would have hoped for it to have a stronger after-sales run than that. Then again, unlike Breath of the Wild, where they had DLC both as a paid expansion and DLC in other games like the Nintendo Labo's VR mode that continued to keep players engaging with the game long after launch, Tears of the Kingdom was very much a one-and-done experience, with Nintendo showing no interest in returning to it and building off it any further. The chart showing the relative sales of the system reveals the surprising resilience of the original Switch model. The great advantage of this model for them is the large margin it offers because it is older and presumably easier to produce, although of course some of those parts may have become more expensive over time as well. But I do think if the difference in profitability between the OG and OLED model has shrunk, and the OLED model has the fringe benefit of being $50 more expensive to start with, we could see moves to clear inventory of the existing system. Console sales in the first quarter of this calendar year were only about a third down on last year, which had quite a few big titles, and software sales were down 15%. This, I think, is the trend that Nintendo most needs to address, and while they don't have any games that are likely to be as absolutely vast as Super Mario Wonder and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, I would not bet against Super Mario Party Jamboree, and my hunch would be that given the development costs of titles such as Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, it will make a tidy profit for them. I have to say the relative lack of sales of the Switch Lite is a little surprising to me. Japan has always been a handheld-loving market particularly, but previous Nintendo handhelds have done extremely well. Nevertheless, while the Switch Lite was a big success around the pandemic, particularly with the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons, it's a tiny proportion of the Switch playbase, and I find that curious, as given its more attractive price, I thought more people might have been tempted on board. Of course, there is a new model, Switch Lite, accompanying the Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, and I would anticipate there will be even more focus on pushing Switch Lite as the new system is unveiled, because just like the 2DS in 2018 and 2019, it will represent the absolute cheapest entry point into Nintendo's console lineup. The number of playing users is also up, but I'm always a little suspicious of this number, as they seem to interpret it so broadly that if you turn the machine on once during the calendar year, even if you never then play a game, you're still classified as an active user. I mean, sure, but I'd love to know if their granular data gives a better idea of how many people are active in the sense of being monthly, weekly, or even daily users of the console. I'm sure they do have this data, and I dare say that they do look at it quite often, but of course it's not something that they have a particular interest in sharing with the general public, perhaps because many of those users are not that much more active than turning on the console perhaps once a year. Not to say that many people don't play an awful lot of Switch, just that the core playing base of gamers may be somewhat smaller than these numbers could suggest. A few more things stand out to me. On page 15, under the section about initiatives to expand Nintendo's IP, they mention March the 10th being Mario Day. Given that they have been rather circumspect about these days before, and again I've got another video on it, I think it's a very significant fact that they've been reiterating the specific day, and I think they definitely want to shape this into one of their calendar landmarks alongside Pokemon Day. Software results then. Big credit for Pikmin 4 to hitting the 3.3 million mark within its first 9 months. That is a legitimately big seller, and it feels like if it had been released earlier in the console's life, it could have done even better. I think fans of trad Mario RPGs will feel pretty pleased with Super Mario RPG's performance as well. It is pleasing to see Splatoon 3 still holding its own in the 3 million sellers, but the real take-home from this is the absolute dominance of Mario in his movie year. Depending on whether you count Luigi's Mansion and Super Smash Bros. As Mario titles, either slightly more or slightly less than half of their million-plus sellers were headlined by the blockbusting movie star. And while a lot of these are attributable to the ongoing evergreen nature of these titles, I do think a tactical choice was made. Between the release of Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle in holiday 2022 and the release of Super Mario Bros. Wonder in 2023, there was an almost unprecedented gap in terms of new Mario titles. You have to go back to the 90s to see a longer gap between Mario titles, which on the surface seemed like utter madness when you have a new film coming out. But I think there was a logic, and you can see it here. They used the early part of the financial year to focus on pushing their legacy Mario titles to new customers brought in via the Mario movie, particularly New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, which was a pack-in title on the system, and they clearly did a very good job of pushing both Mario Party titles. Then they transitioned to creating new Mario experiences with the 1-2 punch of Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Super Mario RPG, followed by Mario vs. Donkey Kong earlier this year, and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door just around the corner. And they're continuing with this greater than previous Mario output with a second holiday season with a double Mario offer in Mario & Luigi Brothership and Super Mario Party Jamboree. Of course, looking at these sales figures, I am slightly gutted not to see Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp make the Hallow Halls of the 1 million sellers list, but I can't say, sadly, I'm enormously surprised. I can only hope it doesn't put Nintendo off returning to this wonderful franchise in the years to come. There's also a slight difference from last year in terms of how they feature their announced titles. This year they specify it's only April to June they're looking at, whereas last year they just gave examples of first-party titles. All this, I guess, being to cloud the waters concerning Metroid Prime 4 so that they could announce it with a bit more fanfare in the recent Nintendo Direct. Okay, so that about wraps up my reactions to Nintendo's recent financial statements, but I've mentioned an absolute ton of videos covering all sorts of aspects linked to Nintendo's business, and so I'm going to recommend this playlist of Nintendo forecasts to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo forecast.